I'm a business leader. It just happens to be that my field of practice is helping organizations realize their fullest social and economic potential through the lens and advocacy of DEI.
So I was doing a little bit of research on you, and I came across this article where the subtitle read the following. Says throughout his career and during his time at Brown, Jarvis Sam has been on a journey of self-discovery, but in his pursuit of finding his authentic self, there is no finish line. And it got me thinking about efforts in DEI across the board, because effectively in a perfect world, you're working yourself out of a job. But I would imagine that you have an ultimate idea of what a finish line may look like, or is there ever a finish line in DEI efforts?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Will. I often hear my colleagues and practitioners in this space talk about that concept of potentially working yourself out of a job. I actually disagree with that premise. I think that the work of equity and inclusion is actually never done. As we see, as time goes on and different horizons change, different groups ultimately end up being at the center of experiences of marginalization. Unfortunately, the raw reality of our work is that because so many different factors, social, political, environmental, economic, tie into the way that we do our work, there's always going to be a need for organizations to understand how do we create equitable approaches and equitable outcomes that serve people and teams. I think the product inclusion space is critical here, Will. If you take a look at what new product development looks like within organizations, every time a company drives innovation to stand up a new product, we have to consider it through the lens of ensuring that it's accessible to all people, albeit disability status, language barriers, or otherwise. And so, with some of those different constraints in mind, the work of equity practitioners to ensure great outcomes for all will forever be something that we have to continue doing.
And to that point, I've heard you talk about before, specifically around the time of George Floyd and coming out of the pandemic, there was so much focus on making sure Black people got equity in the workplace. And then there was this big uprising in, Pacific Islander and Asians talking about they needed, equity. So how do corporations manage effectively so many people, chomping at their heels saying, hey, you got to pay attention to us too, when it changes so frequently?
Yeah, for starters, organizations have got to not look at this as a zero sum game. Unfortunately, so many organizations have positioned the nature of this work through an us versus them mentality. The challenge is the us and them are often too marginalized and minoritized communities ourselves. I recall the exact experience you're describing, Will, when we saw the rise in recognition through a period of racial and social reckoning following the murder of George Floyd, May 25th, 2020. And then by March of 2021, we started to see increasing narratives and stories highlighting this notion of hashtag Stop Asian Hate. In numerous organizations, you saw this conflict begin to be developed between how communities are interacting with one another, where support systems are built versus not. And you literally saw organizations positioning a perspective that, well, we gave this much money to Black communities, and so we need to think about how do we support AAPI communities. The harsh reality, though, is that the experiences of the communities are so different. And when you position it as a zero sum game, it assumes that there's only this amount of pie that's available for us to fight over. Meanwhile, those that exist in the space of the dominant discourse are enjoying all of their nourishment and fruits and delight on this side. For organizations to be successful here, the lens of equity requires us to consider the specific needs of key organizations and recognizing where our companies may have been complicit in the marginalization of those communities. Take, for example, the sports industry, and certainly in the footwear industry. Arguably, every streetwear, lifestyle, or performance based footwear brand has benefited off of the contributions of Black bodies, whether it's the athletes that represent these organizations through a sports marketing lens, or the consumers that patronize their businesses and organizations every single day in physical platforms and digital. These organizations then have an obligation to think about how they support these communities that are a part of the building and development of their bottom line. To do this effectively, though, we cannot see the work of support of marginalized communities at odds with one another. but rather recognize that to truly move towards systemic solutions means gaining a stronger understanding of where we've been and how we got here. How does this show up in the present and its impact and implication on people? And then what investments are we going to make as an organization to ensure a betterment of the future?
I want to go a level deeper there because I've heard Black women talk about this. You know, Black women's diversity and equity inside the workplace lags behind Black people in
Yep.
the workplace. And I've heard Black women talk about when organizations and companies talk about women's issues, is Black women get left out and white women ultimately benefit from the efforts that Black women have raised their arms about. What's your take on this?
Will, in addition to my work as the founder and CEO of the Rainbow Disruption, I also teach in academic spaces. So I am a professor of practice at Brown University, and then I work as part of the fully employed MBA program as well with the University of California, Berkeley. And so a lot of my academic research and pursuits center around the topics of intersectionality and identity covering. And so the experience that you're describing is squarely in that space of intersectionality. Originally a theory coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw from UCLA, it argues that these interconnected identities that we have impact either certain privileges that we have in some cases or increasing marginalization in others. This is the exact experience that we see with Black women in the workplace. When organizations talk about women's issues, when organizations talk about making investments in support of women, they're typically talking about experiences for white women. Rarely do they consider the intersectional identity of the approach. You can see this in the way affirmative action policies have been built out. The biggest beneficiary of approaches to affirmative action have indeed been white women. On the flip side, when many of these organizations, especially those in the technology industry, describe experiences of people of color or underrepresented communities, they're typically talking about Black men or Asian men. And so Black women end up getting lost in where and how this work is positioned. And yet, that means that we're not able to effectively solve for some of the challenges that become impediments to her ability to be successful in the workplace. Take pay equity, Will. We often talk about the gender dynamic and the gender pay gap, and yet it was not until recently that we actually started to dig into conversations that found that globally around the world, if we look at where white women are positioned relative to non Hispanic identified white men, and then applied another layer to look at Black women sit at levels even below her white female counterparts. Furthermore, in terms of development, namely mentorship and sponsorship, she's often met with resistance in so many ways around the ability to grow, advance, and develop her career. And what's more, when you add on macro political and macro social layers, like those surrounding the rhetoric and sentiment connected to the Crown Act, that's where we begin to see the biggest implication on her experience, where she has to make a concerted decision every single day how to wear her hair to avoid being the recipient of microaggressive behavior at best and abject discontent and disrespect on what the evolution of her career could actually look like because of how she wears her hair, which, as we know, in the context of hair politics, has so many deep connections to our experiences and identity as Black culture. When we think about the intersection of what it means to be both Black and a woman, she finds herself at this intersection of certain aspects of marginalization where she's fighting to keep up in so many ways to not only the status quo of identity and experience, but she finds herself competing with her white female counterparts because we have been so preconditioned to believe that there is only one seat for us that are available. I'll just add to this, Will. This is why, even more, when I talk in my lectures and the work that I do, I often say that to truly democratize diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have got to create equitable solutions for the most marginalized amongst us. In my work and studies, we've discovered that is Black transgender women. To find yourself at the intersection of not only trans or queer identities, but female identities, as well as being part of the Black community or Black identities, means access to things like environmental protections from an environmental justice standpoint, health equity, and the ability to not only seek care and treatment from folks that understand your experiences, but also the ability to find a job and not be subjected to or underemployment becomes the experiences of those the further you get away from the center, as Bell Hooks describes it, and the further you get closer to the margin.
Yeah. You've talked about growing up, giving speeches and debate as being critical to your success. I want to hear
Yeah.
more about that.
Well, my family has a very long history in the speech and debate space. My mom was a debater. My older brother was a debater. And so in high school, I didn't really feel like I had a choice. It was just kind of what we do in this household. And it had the biggest impact on my life and career. So I went on to debate throughout my years in high school and went on to be a national champion debater for Rice University, and then went on to coach a number of schools at both the high school and collegiate level, including coaching a number of national champions. What speech and debate provides for people is the ability to understand the mode and means of effective communication, both verbal and written. It allows you to understand what self expression of identity is, and it allows you to not only find your voice, not only use your voice, but leverage your voice as a means of having power and impact. The beauty of it is, well, in the DEI space, we often talk about this concept of giving us a seat at the table. And I've often challenged that because this table could be broken. This table could be being held up under the bottom by communities that we don't even see down there, which is the case with
Yeah.
many Fortune 1000 organizations. This table could be rash. I
Yeah.
don't necessarily need the seat at the table. I want the voice in the conversation. I want you to understand my sentiments. I want you to respect it. And I want to have the ability for my sentiments and perspective to be built into the way that this organization runs and thrives strategically and operationally. Speech and debate gave me those skills to understand how to build an effective argument, how to build sound logic, reason, and rationale, and how to combine those great theories that are so deeply rooted in the idea of public speaking, the ethos, logos, and pathos, that being the ethical, emotional, and logical appeals, to be able to forge connections for people, whether I'm informing you about a topic, attempting to persuade you about something, or just trying to make you laugh. This is
Yeah.
why I highly encourage, especially underrepresented communities. One of the biggest issues that we face in both governmental spaces and nonprofit spaces, academic institutions, as well as in our companies, is feeling voiceless, feeling that we don't have a way or means to be a part of this conversation. It's why I encourage underrepresented high school, middle school, and college students enroll in public speaking courses, join speech and debate teams, because the confidence that you build and the ability to find your voice becomes something, will, that no one can take away from you, and it becomes so highly impactful in how we lead and thrive over time.
I've had this conversation with several people recently who built companies, or whether they be small businesses or tech companies, but in traditionally non-melanated spaces, right?
Yeah.
And I ask, I'm always interested in how they manage themselves in environments where they are not represented. Particularly, I was talking to Derek from Cloudy Donut
Yeah,
about
yeah,
an
yeah.
episode or two. Yeah, I was talking to him, and all of his donut shops are in white neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And I was asking him about, how do you manage being, like a real black guy? You love hip hop and et cetera. Like, how do you manage this in those neighborhoods? And he was talking about like how he doesn't assimilate. He is who he is and completely who he is. He doesn't change the vocal tone of his voice, and I'm so interested in your take on this because I was reading something where you said, where I finally began to understand the culture to which I wanted to be a part of, I no longer had to think about this construct of assimilation. I could be myself.
Yeah.
And I think about this from a perspective of there's got to be some wisdom behind that too, because and I want you to correct me if I'm thinking about this wrongly, because I think about, yes, you can be you, but you can't just give. Sometimes you got to give doses until you've proven yourself in
Yeah.
the room. And
Yeah.
so, can you talk about that?
Well, if the question is, did I always look like this? No. I didn't always navigate Fortune 1000 spaces with rainbow locks and living my truth. It was a journey of authenticity. When I think about assimilation, and I'm actually really thrilled to share with the viewers of this podcast, this will actually be the first time that I talk about this publicly. I have just finished the manuscript for my book, DEI Credential, which will be coming out this summer. And in DEI
Congrats.
Credential, one of the pieces that I describe is a definition for me around assimilation. And I posit that assimilation is a tool of the oppressor, which is utilized as a means to destroy culture and character, to degrade history, and heritage, and to overcome the personal to the personality. With
Mm,
assimilation, it forces us to think through gaslighting techniques that who we are, that our experiences, that the loves that we have in life are bad, are harmful, are negative. And that to truly be successful and thrive in a deeply capitalistic environment, we have to harness perspectives that shies away from what our actual cultural heritage is and moves
yeah.
toward or in service of everything that the dominant discourse tells us it should be. Well, I have rejected this almost every single day in my professional career. It's hard. The dissonance that exists between trying to show up as somebody else to serve a group of folks just to get to that next promotion, just to get that next raise, you end up working yourself so much that the burnout, both
Wow.
physically, mentally, and emotionally, becomes so deeply pressured. In the book, I write about this conversation of the emotional tax, also known as the black tax. It's this construct of working twice as hard to only get half the progress or
Yeah.
half the
Yeah.
work. Here's the challenge with that. When I was going into workplaces very early in my career, I found myself giving smaller doses than I should have. And so I found myself in conversations that felt microaggressive, that felt incredibly
Mm,
disrespectful,
mm,
that felt racist, that felt homophobic in so many ways. And I was working in big oil and gas and telecommunications companies. And so when you're doing professional services or client services work, you don't always feel comfortable speaking out about the behaviors of those clients because those individuals are ultimately helping the firm grow and helping the firm thrive. By the time I jumped into the technology industry, though, Will, I changed my whole perspective on this. Now, let me be clear. A lot of folks will walk around and tell you to be your authentic self and bring your full self to work. Uh-uh. My full self does not belong in anybody's corporate space or anybody's corporate setting.
yeah. Yeah.
Me after
Yeah.
5 p.m. is real fun and probably does not belong in the four wall of the corporate. But what I did find is that authenticity is defining those values that are important to you and being unwilling to sacrifice, shift, or move away from those values at any and all cost. And so
Now I
that is
got it.
what was
I got it.
important to me. And so throughout my time at Nike, for example, I came into Nike in April 2018, ball fade, part on the side,
Yeah.
still trying to relive my early 90s truth. And by the time I departed the company in November 2022 to launch my firm, The Rainbow Disruption, I was walking around navigating the world with rainbow locks and dressing exactly how I wanted to. Because those
Yeah.
experiences of growing up as a black man in Houston, those experiences in surrounding myself in queer spaces and LGBTQ plus serving spaces, those are all a part of who I am. And so they have to be brought in spaces because they're a part of that value set that I uphold and that I support. My message to the listeners on this, Will, is I get that what I'm saying is not easy. I'm not saying that you go to your job tomorrow and you're like, I'm good. Here's how I'm gonna show up. Take it or leave it. That's not the case. It is a journey. I recognize and understand that. But what I don't think enough of us do is write down what those values are and then be unwilling and unwavering in the lack of sacrificing those as you navigate workspaces, even if it may come at the impact of your career. We are
Mm.
brilliant. We are great. And so understand and leverage that and recognize that even if that's not a great fit here, there's a lot of organizations that desire your talent there.
That's a perfect segue into my next question. And who people decide to work with can be deeply personal. Like,
Yep.
people like to do business with people that they like, right? And part of the work of diversity is to show the value of having alternate perspectives other than your own at the table
Yeah.
and showing the value
Yeah.
of people. But there's still this human struggle, So I wonder, how do you push corporations like 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 the ones you've worked at, Snap, Google,
Yep.
Nike, and etc. How do you push a corporation without pushing yourself out? Because I think about this, and if you're really good at your job, then they're uncomfortable.
Yep.
And so, is DEI the role of death?
Yeah. It is a really great question, Will. And I think it depends on one, the maturation of the organization in terms of their readiness for great DEI programming and work. And then two, it depends on both the resilience and impact of the leader. I'll say this, hand on heart, working for myself now, owning my own firm and the work that my team does with the Rainbow Disruption, I am no longer bridled or stifled by this duality of having to force the uncomfortable conversation while also having to worry about the political nature of my own career management. Having to think about if I give this leader this type of feedback, which is necessary for them to grow and develop and provide impact in the organization, is that going to impact my performance review or my ability to take on my next role in the company? It's just not something I have to worry about anymore. And so I can show up and authentically engage with the various different clients, partners, and organizations that I work with because that constraint's not there. Like, I'm not on y'all's benefits plan. And so I can talk to you about what is actually necessary in your organization. Will, over the last 3 years, the term diversity, equity, and inclusion, and when it's positioned to people, it's met with resistance by a lot of communities. And the reason that happens is diversity, equity, and inclusion, when done right, is literally a challenge to the status quo. It is a perspective that says the way that we have done things historically have not fostered the outcomes to which we desire going forward. And so, how do we create points of intervention to challenge that systemically? As you can imagine, this causes a lot of fear to a lot of people. Because if you have built your career and your last three promotions have come via some connection to systems of nepotism that have allowed you to grow and develop, and now I'm saying we're actually going to change that. We're going to focus on inclusive hiring measures where we have a diverse slate of talent. We're going to position diversity in our interview panels. And by the way, we're going to think about inclusive succession planning and how we develop, advance, and promote talent. This causes fear with folks where they end up resisting the future state approach. It's not that they actually have a problem with understanding the contours of diversity and what elements of identity is. There is a fear that if you change the system so much that I have been a beneficiary of, I now have no clue what approaches to advancement and development might actually look like. And so, Will, I don't believe that it has to be the role of death. Do I think it's difficult? Absolutely. Do I think DEI leaders really have to focus on the protection of our own mental health and well being? And organizations need to prioritize resourcing to support us? Absolutely. Because the reality is, George Floyd's murder was such a big moment that organizations basically started to position the chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer in essentially a public affairs type role. You got
Right.
CDIOs right now having to be the voice of response when there's an earthquake in Turkey, when there's violence in the form of war between Russia and the Ukraine, when there's continued conflict between Israel and Palestine, with literally every shooting and experience of gun violence in this country, the CDIO is now looked at as the voice of reason and rationality there. That is such a shift in dynamic to where now this leader is playing a role of government and public affairs without the accountability, responsibility, or the authority to actually make
Mhm.
GPA based decisions. They are having to opine on global sustainability based topics without being an expert in spaces of climate change. They are having to navigate conversations about social and community impact without overseeing the multi-million-dollar budgets that are used to be spent in these spaces. For organizations to be successful, you have to understand the significant amount of work that's being put on these leaders. Exhibit the grace with understanding. No, they will not create solutions in 3 years that resolve something that you have built over the last 50, 75, and 100 years in many of these companies. And so we have to understand, how do we give the same rigor and intentionality to social innovation with diversity, equity, and inclusion that we do with product innovation when we're developing that new app, piece of footwear, or apparel based product.
So how do you tie DEI efforts, because they can't just be tied to, this the right thing to do. How do
Yeah.
you tie it to actual value and business goals?
Yeah. There's a few things. I think on the ethical argument for diversity, though, this right thing to do, this so called moral imperative, I don't think we can overlook that too much because a lot of organizations try to move so clearly to the business case. And when you do that, you lose sight of the fact that, like, there's a whole bunch of sociological, anthropological, and psychological impact and implication that got us to where we are today. I need you to understand how periods of antebellum enslavement impacted Jim Crow laws and policies, which now impact how Black communities show up each and every day, and particularly in the workplace. I need you to understand how the media's representation and reifying of certain stereotypes that impact underrepresented communities all come from the history of our experience. So we can't overlook that moral imperative because I argue, Will, it is the right thing to do because we are better. Not saying
Mm,
we are better as people than another group. I'm saying as humanity, we are better than the systems, tools, resources, and processes that we have chosen to accept that continue to put some communities out of the ability to equitably engage in society. We as humanity are better than the tactics and strategies being deployed by the current state of the criminal justice system. This is a topic that we've known for years that continues to have such far reaching impacts and implications, not just on Black and Brown bodies, but Black families, Black men, Black women, so on and so forth. We are better than that, and so we have to resolve that. And so a lot of companies then turn to the business case for diversity. I will tell you, Will, I was very proud when McKinsey and Company released the studies around this work in 2015 and then corroborated it in 2017 and 2018. And then Deloitte and BCG added some additional eminence connected to it. However, the one critique that I've always positioned around the business case, so called, for diversity, equity, and inclusion is that it considers this work in such a deeply aggregated nature that it doesn't force organizations to understand how their own history continues to contribute to the negative impacts and implications of the work. The business case, in many ways, would lead organizations to believe that if you certainly hire or position Black and Brown bodies in certain roles, you're immediately going to see this 35% greater likelihood of financial outperformance. And that's not the reality of the case. If your organization has not done the work to shift your culture or the climate within your organization, this talent that you put in role will not be set up for success. They will continue to be pushing up against a cement ceiling that has always been positioned against them. And then when you don't achieve those great business results that have been highlighted by the study, you can now not hold yourself accountable, but rather blame shift to put it on that individual. And so, Will, to answer your question directly, how then do we tie this to business goals? Goal setting is absolutely critical. Employees care about four main things in the workplace: transparency, visibility, accountability, and belonging. I am a huge fan of the idea of consequential accountability. This is the idea that we as an organization have set a goal or a target that we want to achieve, and there are consequences connected to it, not through the lens of blame, but through the lens of accountability. So when we choose to tie executive compensation, for example, to growth and representation goals, or commitment to DEI education, or advancement to community and social impact policies. In addition to that, when we set these goals, it needs to be specific enough in such a way that even if we position growth opportunities for representation in particular, for growth of women and then growth of communities of color, how are we digging into that concept of intersectionality to make sure that our women numbers are not just growing because of elevation and promotion of white women, and that our people of color or underrepresented numbers aren't just growing because of the hiring and development of new Black or Asian engineers? Rather, how do we understand both through pay equity, through core experience, through education, development, and community that we're solving for those intersections of identity along the way, that we're providing experience and pulse surveys to understand that impact, and that DEI has a place not just on the team and talent strategy for an HR or people and culture organization, but that it is positioned right on that corporate strategy for the organization. That's how you drive results, Will. If every strategy coming out of DEI can tie back in some way to the core goals that the business is looking to drive from a strategy and operations perspective, that's where impact is created. And that is why I often highlight in lectures and series that I do, I'm a business leader. It just happens to be that my field of practice is helping organizations realize their fullest social and economic potential through the lens and advocacy of DEI.
One thing we haven't discussed here that I've got you for a few more minutes, and I want to talk about this concept of supplier diversity, right?
Yes.
And so, one thing many companies lean on as an excuse is, black-owned companies don't have the capacity, particularly corporations. Larger small businesses lean
Yep.
on that.
Yep.
And how can they instead help smaller companies, black-owned companies, build capacity versus count them out?
It is so necessary. The supplier diversity space, it has been around a really long time. In fact, work around supplier diversity has been around longer than a lot of the core team and talent strategies that we know, like the Rooney Rule or the diverse slate approach on the team and talent side. And so there's a number of learnings, especially from folks who I would consider absolute mavens in the space, like McDonald's, like University of Chicago, who continue to do such amazing industry leading work in this space. But you're right, Will, so many companies argue, well, in a competitive process of an RFP, we're just not finding enough black owned businesses that can support this work. And so you end up giving us the small contracts for things like minimal food service, occasionally bringing us in to do some content creation and marketing or videography work, where the big contracts are going to major technology suppliers, major marketing suppliers. For organizations to be successful, they have to move beyond the programmatic and truly go to the systemic. The programmatic is to say, we're going to go out and create this list of underrepresented suppliers, and hopefully they land. We're going to try to position these black small businesses into these smaller areas within our company or organization. Rather, we should be finding ways to help them grow to scale and through the lens of sustainability. Help them understand what results in a successful RFP within your organization. Help them by positioning some of the smaller entities within your company or organization to be successful. For example, if we think about the footwear industry, while a vendor may not yet be perfect for Nike Inc., could they do work to support the Converse brand to understand the infrastructure around the organization and build from there? While an organization may not be fully equipped, for example, to support a large retailer, could they work on one aspect of the merchandising space? That way they're knee deep in the ecosystem and growing and developing. And then what's more, how are companies actually investing money into ensuring that these businesses can grow by providing them core skills on how to effectively run a business? When you think about some of the major, I'll even say Fortune 100 companies, will, they have some of the best communications teams, operations teams, supply chain teams, merchandising teams. What would it look like to have those leaders and their teams extend pro bono support and engagement with these organizations to ensure that their business model is airtight, so that when they come to you a year from then with an RFP, they're not only competitive in the process, but we know how they grow to scale. If your organization is focused on the impact that you're having in terms of carbon reduction, for example, to drive towards some climate change goals, make sure that you're equipping these folks with the knowledge up front so that they're aligning their own approach to global sustainability with that you have as an organization. And finally, we'll align to the same previous question that you asked around goal setting. We have got to set targets around supplier diversity. But I want to see disaggregated targets because a lot of companies will set $1 billion targets, $5 billion targets over the course of a couple of years. If you dig into it, the majority of those funds are going to turn women owned businesses, which is absolutely incredible. We do need to be investing even more significantly in women owned businesses and in veteran owned businesses and in underrepresented owned businesses. However, if we're not considering if 90% of those women owned businesses are owned by white women and that none of the funding is being distributed or allocated to support Black women, Latina women, Native women, or First Nations women, or AAPI women, we have not done our job effectively. We're giving ourselves a pat on the back for what is arguably a participation trophy to make us feel good or better about what we're doing. It's often argued that disaggregation of data helps us to make more intentional and deliberate and accurate decision making. And so I implore organizations, disaggregate it. Hold yourselves accountable and enable your consumers, vendors, and stakeholders to be a part of that journey with you.
And finally, I have a question that I want you to answer two different ways.
Yeah.
So, in the matter of respecting DEI expertise, right? So, if I'm a business and I'm looking for a DEI person, how do I know that this person can actually do the job effectively? One,
Yeah.
and how can I be a respected DEI leader?
Yeah. I think on the first front, Will, this is so topical. Following George Floyd's murder, I saw a lot of organizations either go out to the marketplace to find DEI leaders, and I found others elevate leaders within their organization. Some elevated leaders that had a great experience in the space, or at least knew some effort around how to drive great progress in the org. Others elevated leaders who simply had a passion for it. It is unfair to those leaders. When I think about other functions within an organization, as I said, to drive DEI effectively, we must think about it in connection to our business strategy and business operations. In no other function would we ever take a leader and just position them in a role based off an element of identity and passion. Will, I actually really like product development. I almost failed out of art class in eighth grade. I can't draw. And so my passion for design and product development does not mean that I can go and become a chief design officer at a Fortune 500 company. And so the
Yeah.
fact that we have taken, in some cases, this very lackadaisical approach around just placing a talent in role, it's unfair to the organization. It's unfair to all equity serving communities that are a part of that engagement with the organization. And it's unfair to that person because when they step into the role and they are unable to be successful because they've never driven approaches that actually foster systemic change in this arena, we still point the finger at them because the accountability exists within them. All the other leaders will have absolved themselves of their own accountability and how they drive progress in this space. And so that leader is ultimately unsuccessful. And so for businesses, I highly encourage them think about what engagement and partnerships, for example, with firms like mine might look like with the Rainbow Disruption. We can help vet great DEI leaders for and with you, as well as help to establish the infrastructure that's necessary as you build your own strategy and operating model around engagement in this space. The whole goal is we need to be doing this work to drive longer term sustainability and to ensure that we're creating measurable and monitorable frameworks to do the work even more effectively. And so organizations have to make sure that they are prioritizing both experience and knowledge in the space, even more than passion. And lived experience is critical, though. I see a lot of organizations promoting and elevating folks who do not speak from the community or do not speak from the eye of experience. And that's tough. It does not mean that these
Yeah.
folks cannot, as allies, advocate or act as activists for the communities that are there. But unfortunately, the Black experience is one that is so unique in the United States and in various spaces, various parts of Western Europe, certainly South Africa. And so we need folks in these roles that can actually speak to those experiences, that understand what it means to be at the margin of experiences of racial minoritized status, to be able to actually impact change. On the flip side, for DEI leaders, well, I get the question a lot in my LinkedIn inbox and when I do lectures at universities of a number of college students who are like, I want to go into the DEI space. And I think part of it is rooted in Gen Z and Gen Alpha's strong knowledge, connection, and commitment to overcoming systems of oppression and resolving things like institutional and structural racism. And yet, in most cases, I tell them, don't do it immediately out of college. I think there is something so critical about getting experiences outside of this space, whether it's in HR directly, in marketing, in product roles, in finance, in sales. There is something so critical about learning foundations and fundamentals of how businesses run and operate so that when you do step into the DEI role, you can be effective and you can drive great work and progress. Now, I get it, Will. That may sound a bit counterproductive or counterintuitive to exactly what I just argued, this idea that you need to be hiring experienced professionals. My recommendation is enter an organization and do a role in a different function for 2 to 3 years, and then step in as a coordinator, as a specialist, as a junior manager to learn the framework and understanding of the space. Read the text from leaders that are driving thought leadership and engagement here. Follow the right folks on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn that are positioning thought leadership on this topic, and then parlay that into a growth and development opportunity in the space. Furthermore, though, I highly encourage my peers and colleagues in the space that are chief diversity officers or DEI leaders, uh, continue to grow in your own practice. Like, keep yourself sharp. I talk to a lot of DEI leaders that at times I feel like they may rest on their laurels of their experience from doing this work so well and for so many years. The reality, though, Will, is times are changing so significantly. And as Gen Z and Gen Alpha are very actively and rapidly entering the workforce, expectations are different. There are many DEI practitioners who have not had to navigate this construct of identity, for example, around pronoun utilization and understanding how to create inclusive spaces for transgender and non binary communities. They have not had to navigate conversations around neurodiversity and neurodivergence. They have not had to navigate effective accommodations for individuals with disabilities. We all have to continue to grow in our own countenances to be sharp, to be effective, and to grow this work even more while also ensuring to protect our own well being.